Nick, we need to turn that down. It seems a little too loud. Thank you. Says the acoustic. There's one lunch left for you.
That's yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're so pleased to have you on the very last day of school for spring 2025. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Mariana Figueiro here as our distinguished lecturer in our Durham School Distinguished Lecture Series. Dr. Figueiro is a lighting expert, and I had an opportunity to share with her a little earlier about how strong our lighting program is at the Durham School. I'm very pleased to have her come and speak to our group. She is currently the Mount Sinai Professor of Light and Health Research at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She directs their Light and Health Research Center, and she's been there. It's in New York City, isn't it, Dr. Figueiro? I believe it's in New York. Yep. So she's been there 4 years. And before that, she was at Rensselaer Polytechnic at their Lighting Research Center for 24 years, I believe I heard you say. So has been working in lighting for a very long time. She has a bachelor's in architectural engineering from the Federal University of Figueiro in Brazil, and a master's and doctorate from RPI. And she's been working for a very long time on lighting and has covered many, many topics, and will be sharing them with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Figueiro.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I have to say, when I was at RPI, we had a lighting program. So we used to do a lot of work with students. When we moved to Sinai about 4.5 years ago, we don't have an educational program, so we're pretty much research-based. So I do miss talking to students and interacting with students. So it's a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for the invitation. All right, I do want to acknowledge our sponsors. A lot of the work you're going to be seeing here can only be done if you have grants, and we have been very fortunate with grants, and let's hope that it continues that way. All right, so let me start just with the general definition of light, and you might be thinking, why am I starting with that? Because mostly of what I'm going to talk about doesn't actually fall within that definition of light, because light is really just limited in a way to radiant energy that it's capable of exciting the retina and producing visual sensation in humans. And the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum extends from about 380 to 780 nanometers. And we, as many of you that work with lighting, know that we do have what we call the luminous efficiency function, or V lambda, that really weighs radiant power to allow us to calculate and put it in all our light bulbs, the lumen. But as hopefully you will learn from this presentation, this is a very limited definition of light. And what we have been doing for the past few years is really trying to understand all of the other effects of light. And here's just a summary. I like to start with this graph because it gives you an idea of how impactful light can be. It not only allows us to see, but even within our visual system, it has really different channels that allows us to do different things. And we'll just briefly cover and summarize some of those, because the goal of the lecture today is to talk about what we call the non-visual systems. But lighting can also help us with culture, experiences, perceptual system, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing to help minimize risks for falls at those that are high risk for falls. And then what we call the non-visual systems. Some people say that that's an oxymoron, but despite the different opinions out there, the reason why it's called non-visual system is because it's not light that goes into the brain, in the parts of the brain that are associated with visual response, but it goes to other parts of the brain that are associated with affecting our biological clock, as well as a direct acute alerting effect, which I call it a cup of coffee. So briefly starting with the visual system, we do know that there are models of relative visual performance, or we call RVP. You know the visual size, you know the luminous contrast, you know what the retinal illuminance is, and you can plug it in a set of math and come up with what we call the relative visual performance. And I can tell you that if you follow the Illuminating Engineering Society recommended practices or the IES handbook, you are probably going to be designing to be at the plateau of these curves. So basically, we are designing for visibility. We're designing to be able to see things in the space, to read black fonts and white paper, or to thread a needle, or whatever the task is. That's normally what we are designing for, and what we use that relative visual performance models for. Now, we also design for things like appearance of the space and brightness, okay, which are not always predicted by the relative visual performance model. In fact, if you think about our brightness perception for the same lux level at the eye, for example, if you have 100 lux at the eye, if you're designing the space with a warm light color or 2700 K light source, this lighted environment illuminated with the 2700 K will appear less bright than the same environment illuminated with the 6500 K at the same lux level, because we tend to have more sensitivity at short wavelengths for what we say brightness perception. And I think what's important about designing for the lighted environment is that, yes, task visibility is very important, but perception of the space is very important too. So sometimes, we are vertical species, and sometimes we should design for brightness, because if we're not going to do any visual task or reading black fonts and white paper in the space, we might want to be just designing for brightness, for example. So again, you have to define what is your design goals, and then use those different quote unquote metrics to be able to affect our visibility. And then you have color appearance, where, it is very important, and we design for that. A lot of times people use color range reindex, and then there are other metrics now that are coming out for improving color appearance in the space. But one thing to always remember is that color appearance is also related to light levels in the space. At low light levels, you're not going to be able to see colors as well as you would see at high light levels. And when we have to distinguish, for example, a black pair of socks from a navy blue pair of socks, the best way to do that is just get close to a window or increase the amount of light so that it allows us to see colors better. And then we have things that we think about, which are glare, reflection, shadows, depending on the task. We need to control for that. And sometimes, depending on what you want to see, some of those reflections are actually good to be able to see things. But in general, for the built environment, you're trying to minimize glare and reflections and minimize shadows so that you have a better visual environment. So this is as much and as a detail I'm going to get into the visual system, because I'm sure that's a lot of what everybody learns when they go to lectures and when talking about lighting, because that's really sort of one of the most well-known areas of, I tell people, you turn the lights on, you see, you turn them off, you don't see. And that's how we think about lighting. In terms of the perceptual system and culture and experience, there's one thing we know in terms of the message. You can send a message to people in the space depending on how you light the space. For example, in commercial applications, having the lights on is very important to tell people that the business is open, for example. You'll pass in front of a business, the first thing that you say, is it open? And then it said, no, the lights are off. So it's off. So there's a message that we can set with the lighting that sometimes we do it without even paying attention that we're doing, but it's a very easy thing to do. And then you have things like the preference for view, or what they call the biophilia hypothesis, which is that they claim that we humans have a strong need to be in contact with nature. And of course, we all love to have a window and be able to have a nice view. And there's a lot of interesting research showing that we humans crave for new information. So being able to have view, but more important, being able to have changing view helps us with maintaining us interested in what we're doing and interested in information, because the brain is craving for that. The other area that it's interesting about message, it's actually more associated with color. And the reason why I'm bringing that in, because I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we have been doing using red light to increase alertness, especially in night shift workers. And I started to try to understand that research, trying to go back and understand what is it about colors, and how does it affect humans. And I was very interested because there's a lot of work being done. And in this case, it's not necessarily colored light, it's just colors in general. But for example, red, which the reason why I was interested, because we had some of the research looking at the impact of red light on alertness. There was this work from Andrew Elliott, he's at University of Rochester, that basically says that the red color, it's like a danger cue, because we associate red with danger, with fire, with things that are threatening. And then what happens when your body sees a threat, it immediately automatically mobilizes your energy and flee or flight. So it would be the flight and fight system. So there's this immediate response with certain colors. And interesting enough, they've shown that people in China have even strong response to that, because the color red is very strong in China, for example. And there has been studies where people have looked at people wearing red t-shirts or blue or gray t-shirts, and that people characterized people that were wearing red t-shirts as being angrier, or looking like they were angrier than those in the other color t-shirts. There has been work showing that if you have a hand grip that has a red color, you actually exert more force on the hand grip, for example. And these are things that you do without even thinking about it, or without even processing the information. Oh, it's red, it seems like there's an internal reaction to do something like that. And then there has been studies with red as making people look more attractive. So you have red lipsticks or red dresses when people go on a date and so on. It sounds like there's an impact of that. Now, I don't do research in specifically that psychological effect of red, but there is some work out there showing that we do have an emotional response to certain kinds of colors. And then the third area of the perceptual system is the work that we've been doing looking at horizontal vertical lights. So the idea is that you have these lights around door frames. And when people get up at night, for example, that they have to use the bathroom at night, and that's particularly true with older people, they tend to get disoriented. And the reason is, and I'm sure college students will understand what I'm about to say, which is when you are drunk and you close your eyes, it seems like you get dizzier. If you have never tried, try it next time, but just be safe. And the reason is that your visual system actually feeds back into your perceptual system, and it helps you with maintaining postural control and stability. So the idea was, can we use these horizontal vertical night lights to help people when they get out of bed orient themselves in the space and minimize the risk for falling. And then the other area is one of the things that we noted with older people is that when they walk, especially in environments that they're not very familiar or don't feel very safe, they tend to look down. So having those horizontal lights, just like runaway lights, for example, helps them to walk with more stability. And I'll show some data on the horizontal vertical lights around door frames. And then the next area that I'm going to focus more of the talk is what we call the non-visual effects. And even within the non-visual effects, I'm going to talk a little bit about circadian entrainment or phase shifting, which is keeping you in sync with your local time on Earth. And then the other area would be the alerting effects of light, which I call it basically a cup of coffee. So let me start with the circadian system. Circadian rhythms are every rhythm in our body that repeats at approximately every 24 hours, circles about D is a day. Circadian rhythms are generated and regulated by a master clock in the brain. In humans, if we stay in a dark cave for many days without any cues from the external environment, with any light-dark cycle, we are going to continue to have circadian rhythms, but these rhythms are going to run with a period slightly longer than 24 hours. On average, about 24.2 hours. So what happens is every day you would be 10 or 15 minutes out of sync with your watch. But again, you're in a dark cave. You don't have to wake up at 8 o'clock to be in class. So who cares? But if you have to wake up every day to sit in class at 8 o'clock, you want to make sure that your internal clock is in sync with your watch so that when your alarm goes off at 7 o'clock, your biological clock says, oh yes, it's 7 o'clock and I want to get up. And this is what light does. Light dark patterns reaching the back of our eyes are the major synchronizer of the biological clock to your external clock. So every day when we wake up and we get light in the morning, we basically reset our clock so that it runs with a period of 24 rather than 24.2 hours. Now, if we don't get that morning light, and that might actually be true in the winter months when you have to go to class very early and the sun is not out and you end up in a very crappy lighting inside the built environment, or when you're a shift work or when you have to pull an all-nighter, that you get too much light during the nighttime when you're supposed to be in the dark asleep. Light can be a major disruptor. And we do know from the literature that circadian disruption, oh, I started the thing, let me just stop here, that circadian disruption has a huge impact on health and well-being. So this is just to show you the idea of how light and dark synchronizes your internal clock to your external clock. So think of each of these metronomes. One is your internal, one is your external. And here you have this little arrow or whatever it looks like going between day and night. So this is what happens when we're in a dark cave. So you see that you have a constant light or constant darkness. So these things start in sync and then suddenly you're totally out of sync. You just have basically, you're not in sync with your day and night. Those two things are running totally separately. And, I would say that jet lag in a way is that you start completely out of sync, and then eventually what happens is if you go out in the light dark patterns, when you start getting that robust rhythm of light and dark, you'll see that these two are slowly going to be in sync. So this is what happens to us. So when you travel multiple time zones, you start getting the light dark pattern in the destination that you are in, and then slowly you're going to end up in sync. And if you continue to get that robust light dark pattern, your biological clock is going to continue in sync. Now, if it's not in sync, it's disrupted. And if it's disrupted, we have shown that circadian disruption is associated with a series of maladies. In the short term is sleep disruption, feeling tired, feeling fatigued, lower performance. if you are disrupted for many years, such as what happens with shift workers, for example, we've shown or we've seen that there's a huge impact on things like diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and even cancer. So there's huge side effects of being disrupted for a long period of time. So when you think about the sleep-wake cycle, it's actually a great example of circadian rhythms. We're supposed to be awake during the day, asleep at night, and that's supposed to happen every day. And that is because your biological clock is telling you to stay awake during the day and go to sleep at night. In addition to your biological clock, the other thing that influences your sleep is what we call sleep homeostasis or sleep pressure. And basically what that is if you have a good night's sleep, you wake up in the morning and you have no sleep pressure because you just got up. As you start going through the day and accumulating number of hours awake, you start accumulating sleep pressure. So what your biological clock kind of counteracts that sleep pressure. The other thing that counteracts that sleep pressure is caffeine, because that sleep pressure, what it does, it generates adenosine in the brain. And what caffeine does, it blocks the adenosine receptors in the brain. So adenosine makes you feel sleepy. By blocking the receptors in the brain, you don't feel as sleepy. So having obviously those two things, one is caffeine, and one is having your biological clock in sync so that it knows that it's morning and afternoon, and it should be counteracting the effect of the sleep homeostasis. That is what helps you stay awake during the day. And then at night, it's the opposite. Your biological clock tells you to stay awake, and you have a lot of sleep pressure by the time it gets 10, 11 o'clock at night because you've been awake for long periods of time during the day. And that's when you crash and you fall asleep. But if you lose the synchrony between these two systems, you start having problems sleeping. And the other problem, in addition to circadian disruption, is sleep disruption or sleep disturbances. We know now, when I did my PhD, my advisor wanted me to answer the question, why do we sleep? And I told him, well, I want to graduate because there's been years of people trying to understand why we sleep, and nobody really knows. So we're starting to make some breakthrough into it, but I think there's still a lot that we don't know, because if you think about it, when you are asleep, you are vulnerable because you are disconnected from the environment, and yet you need to sleep every day, because if you don't sleep every day, a lot of bad things can happen. And one of the hypotheses is that when you are awake, you start accumulating debris in the brain. And when you sleep, you get the spinal fluid, that the interstitial fluid that goes through the brain, and it cleans up that debris that you accumulate during the daytime. So basically, it's almost like when you have a clogged drain, and what sleeping does is it unclogs that drain and it helps things flush better. The other important thing that happened during sleep is that sleep promotes learning and consolidates memory. So if you think that pulling an all-nighter for an exam is a good thing, well, it's not. You're better off studying in the evening and then having a good night's sleep and doing your exam the following day, because by sleeping, you're actually consolidating what you learned during the prior evening. Now, one of the things that we have been very interested for many, many years, since we started back at the Lighting Research Center and we continue here, is we want to understand what is light for the circadian system. Remember, I said light, right now, the formal definition is just light for visibility. What is light for the circadian system? Now, there was a lot of very interesting study, and in 2002, there was a new class of photoreceptor that was discovered in the retina. So we know we have rods that are typically used during the nighttime. We have cones, 3 types of cones: short, middle, and long wavelength cones that are typically used for daytime vision. And then we discovered a new class of photoreceptor called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or IPRGCs. And what was discovered about this photoreceptor is that it has a direct link between the retina and the biological clock in the brain. So it definitely is a photoreceptor that is extremely important for helping light that reaches the back of the eye get transduced to the biological clock in the brain. Now, what's interesting is that this is not the only photoreceptor that participates in what we call circadian phototransduction. The IPRGCs, they receive input from the rods and cones. They accumulate that input plus the input that, because they are photosensitive themselves, they combine that input and they send that input to the biological clock. So we have developed what we call a mathematical model where we model how is it that all these classes of photoreceptors interpret that information in the retina and send the signal to the brain. And what we developed, remember I mentioned V lambda. V lambda is the spectral sensitivity function looking at just one aspect of visibility. And then we developed the spectral sensitivity function for the circadian system, which first of all, it's very sensitive to short wavelength or blue light. It has a peak sensitivity at about 460 nanometers. And the second thing about the circadian system is that it's much less sensitive to light than the visual system. So if you're talking about a night light in your environment at night, you're able to navigate in the space really well because you can see where you're going in the space, but that light is not effective at activating the circadian system. So I'm going to talk a lot about during some of the applications and some of the work that we have done in the field. I'm going to talk a lot about circadian stimulus, or CS. And the way we've been using that is we've been using a CS of about 0.3, which is midway here in the curve on the right, as being the minimum amount of light that you need to be exposed to during the daytime hours. And then during the nighttime hours, you need to be exposed to less than 0.1 in terms of circadian stimulus. So it's that robust contrast between daytime light and nighttime light that is important for the circadian system. So keep those numbers because you're going to hear a lot about it. Now, you don't need to know all the math that goes behind the model. We did develop this circadian stimulus calculator. So you get the spectral power distribution of your light source, you get the light level at the eye, and then you can calculate the circadian stimulus, and that's freely available on the website. So for you to be able to use it. Now, one thing that it's very important is that we in lighting tend to talk a lot about spectrum. And I think the reason is manufacturers can manipulate spectrum. So you end up hearing a lot about spectrum. And then you hear about things like blue enriched and all these things that are, sometimes are fingernail on a blackboard for me, but that's a different talk. What I want to point out, and I want you to remember, is it's not just about spectrum. And in fact, the impact of spectrum on the circadian system is actually much smaller than, for example, the impact of the amount of light on the biological clock. So we did some simulations, and we compared a 3000 K light source to a 5000 K light source. So one is a warmer color, one is a cooler color, and if it's a cooler color, it has a little bit more short wavelength than a warmer color. So everybody thinks, oh, it's better for the circadian system. Well, not always. If you have 300 lux on the work plane, which is about 100 lux at the eye, if you use a 3000 K light source, 0 of the 12 lights that we evaluated is of 0.3, which is what we want for the daytime. And then only 2 out of 12 would meet at the 5000 K. Now, if you increase light levels on the work plane from 300 to 500 lux, you now have 9 out of 12 on the 3000K and 11 out of 12 on the 5000K that meet that criteria. So as you can see, going from 300 to 500 helped a lot more on achieving your criteria than going from a 3000K to a 5000K. So that gives you an idea of how much more important light levels are than spectral, even though we talk a lot about spectrum when it comes for the circadian system in the lighting industry. And about circadian system is timing of exposure is very important. Just remember, morning light makes you go to bed earlier, evening light delays your bedtimes. So a lot of people talk a lot about, oh, what about using my phone and my iPad during the night before going to bed? There is a possibility that if you use that for 2 or 3 hours prior to going to bed, that you are going to be delaying your sleep times because that evening light delays the timing of the biological clock. Now, what's very important about the biological clock is that it cares about all of the light that you get throughout the 24 hours. So if you get outdoor a lot of light during the daytime, that light from your phone will be much less significant than if you're in a dim room all day. Then that light on the phone may be much more impactful. So when you think about the circadian system, you're thinking about every photon that you've been getting throughout the day, not just a one-time light. Distribution, I'm just going to tell you, light at the back of the eye. That's what you need to care about. And that's really, it's moving from what lighting is used to it, because lighting only thinks about light on the task, light on horizontal surfaces. We're talking about here, light reaching the back of the eye. That is what is important for the circadian system. So given that background, I'm going to just now briefly go through all the projects that we have, well, some of the projects, not all of them, that we have worked with that have been showing that if you do a robust light dark pattern in the built environment, you actually help people sleep better and you improve some health outcomes. So the first project we did, it's been a long time. We went to 5 federal buildings, federal workers buildings. This was with General Service Administration, this project. We collected light exposure that people were being exposed to in the built environment. So we have a calibrated light meter that measures circadian stimulus instead of measuring just lux. And we measured how much light people were being exposed to. And then we split the sample. This was about 130 people that we measured. And then we split the samples into those who were receiving that CS of 0.3, which is what the minimum amount of light we think you need during the daytime hours. And those that were exposed to less than 0.1, which was really almost below threshold for activating the circadian system during the daytime. And what we saw was that those that were exposed to higher amounts of circadian stimulus, they took longer to fall asleep. They had lower rates of depression, which is the CESD scores. And they reported having less sleep disturbances, or the Pittsburgh Sleepiness Quality Index, or PSQI score. So a lower PSQI, less than 5, means you don't have sleep disturbances. So basically getting more light during the day helped you sleep better at night and feel less depressed. We then did, during COVID-19, it was interesting, we were trying to find work we could do from home because you're a lab, and what do you do when you're not sitting in the lab? So one of the things that we did, we sent out this survey, and the hypothesis was, well, we all had to go home, start working at home in our basements. Our basements are probably not very well lit. How does that affect us? Do we sleep better or worse? And the hypothesis was that those that were actually working from their dining rooms with a lot of windows were doing much better than those that were working in their dark basements. So we got over 700 responses, and we only included those working from home or that were unemployed, staying at home. And what we found was actually pretty interesting. If you look at the at-home light exposure, we also asked them the time, how much time they spent outdoors. And these are different PROMIS scores. So those are standardized scores about sleep disturbances, anxiety, depression, and positive affect. And 50 is the norm for that scale. So anything above 50 is worse, except for the positive affect. And anything below 50 is better. And you can clearly see that as you increase the amount of light that people were exposed to at home, they were reporting having fewer sleep disturbances, less anxiety and depression, and more positive affect. Same thing with outdoor lighting. Spending 1 to 2 hours outdoors, they were again self-reporting better sleep, less anxiety and depression, and more positive affect. And then a third study we did was also during COVID. That was in November and 2020. So we're still not as bad, but we're still working with COVID. And we looked at one of these buildings where they had these electrochromic glasses. So the interesting thing about the electrochromic glasses, I don't know how much you know about it, but they tend to change, sort of have this electrochromic filter where when there's sun hitting the window, it actually filters out the heat and the IR and a little bit of the long wavelengths, but they let a lot of blue light in. So they're actually a very effective light source for the circadian system. And it avoids people pulling down their shades, because typically when you have the sun hitting your face, you're going to pull down your shades, and then you're not going to get any circadian effective light. So we collected data in 20 residents. There were 28 days, so it was a 4-week study. And then we split 10 and 10. 10 participants started with those smart windows, and 10 started with the blinds, which was basically you have the blind halfway as the control condition. And then we reversed it after 2 weeks, 1 week in baseline, 1 week in one of these conditions. We took another week of baseline and we reversed the conditions for the subject. So it was a within subjects design. And then on the last day of each week, we measured 24 hours of what we call a vitality survey. And then at night, we measured saliva samples for their dim light melatonin onset. And what dim light melatonin onset is the timing in which we start producing melatonin. So melatonin is a hormone we produce at night in darkness, and it facilitates sleep. And it typically starts being produced about 2 hours prior to our natural sleep. So if your melatonin is being produced later, you're going to fall asleep later. What happens is kids or anybody will fall asleep later, and then they have an alarm clock because they have a fixed wake up time. So you end up shortening your sleep, which can be negative for health. And what we found was for the smart windows, we had a consistent melatonin onset. And for the blinds, we had a 15-minute delay in the melatonin onset, but that was only over the course of a week. So if you think about weeks in a row, if that 15-minute delay accumulates, it ends up that you're going to end up sleeping a lot later after a few weeks without this morning light. We also saw an earlier sleep onset in the group that had the smart windows. Why? You get morning light, it helps you go to bed earlier. And there was a sleep debt compensation on Friday night in the group that was in the blind. So they tended to sleep more Friday nights, probably because they were sleep deprived during the week. And then we saw a very consistent cycle of vitality with a high vitality in the morning and a low energy levels before going to bed, which is what you want, so that people go to bed and they're tired. And there was a delay in that peak vitality with the blinds, suggesting all of these outcomes is suggesting that by not getting that light during the day when you're working from home, you are delaying your sleep, you are sleeping less, and you're getting more tired in the morning and less tired in the evening. Now, that was with healthy people. Okay, all of these people were general workers, healthy people, and what we saw was that if you give them more light during the day, you help them sleep better at night. Now we're starting to talk more about people that are unhealthy or that have some health problems, and one of the areas we're working with is with myeloma transplant patients. So myeloma transplant patients, they tend to be in the hospital during the transplant for 2 to 3 weeks, and they they get very sick. And obviously, in the hospital, I don't know how many of you visited hospitals and healthcare facilities, but the lighting is not the best in the world, and the rooms tend to be very dark, and they don't get enough light during the daytime. So they could be, by being there for 2 to 3 weeks, they can be more disrupted, or they can start getting disrupted because they're not getting that robust light dark pattern. So we did this study many years, I think it was 2015, almost 10 years ago, where Acuity built these fixtures for us. And we put these fixtures in the hospital rooms. And the fixtures were on for from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. for 3 hours a day. There was a control light that delivered really low light levels, and an active light that delivered that circadian stimulus of 0.3. And we measured a variety of outcome measures. This is one of the outcomes that we published, showing that we looked at depression, and we collected data at baseline, 2 days post-transplant, 7 days post-transplant, and then 14 days post-transplant, which was about the time that they were about to leave the hospital. And we saw that at that 14-day post-transplant, there was a significant decrease in the depression levels in those that received the active light or the circadian stimulus of 0.3. We also saw other outcome measures that were positive. There was fewer transplant-related complications, lower levels of depression. I showed the graphs. There was an increase in their overall melatonin levels at night, suggesting that they were more synchronized and entrained. We did see a decrease in their levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So we measured blood samples and looked at their inflammatory markers, and there was a decrease in those inflammatory markers. And there was a decrease in neutropenic fever, which is really one of the bad side effects that they have, compared to the ones that received the control light, or the basically a circadian ineffective light. So we are actually expanding that work. We got a new grant to run that in a 200 patient population, and we're working with Memorial Sloan Kettering here in New York. The other big area that we work with is lighting for neurodegenerative diseases. So it's Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment disease, as well as Parkinson's disease. So this is a study that was done some time ago by Joos van Someren in the Netherlands. And he showed that if he exposed Alzheimer's disease patients to about 1,200 lux at the eye the entire day for 4 weeks, he was able to consolidate the rest activity patterns. So if you look at the graphs on the right, the black bars are activity. So it's almost like it's a wrist actigraph, which is almost like a Fitbit type device. And the black bars are activity. So before the lighting intervention, the top one, these guys were only sleeping between 2 and 5 a.m. in the morning. After 4 weeks of the lighting intervention, you see this beautiful consolidated rest activity rhythm, and they were sleeping from 10 a.m. to 6 a.m. And then he removed the light, and after 4 weeks, they went back to being totally messed up. So he clearly showed that robust light during the day helps consolidate the rest activity rhythms in Alzheimer's patients. They repeated that study. They followed patients for 3.5 years, and they show that light attenuated cognitive deterioration by 5%, ameliorated depressive symptoms by 19%, and attenuated the increase in functional limitations by over half. So it was a real effect. So what we did is we started tuning the light a little bit more, bringing the light closer to the participant so that you didn't have to have 1100 lux at the eye. At the eye, we were working with about 400 lux at the eye. We used about, we've been using 3000 K, and in the beginning we were using 4000 K light sources, but we were putting them a little bit closer to the eye. And again, delivering that circadian stimulus of 0.3. So we did a couple of studies. One was a short-term study, which we had a randomized placebo-controlled crossover design. What that means is you have a baseline, you have an active or a control light first. We exposed them to 4 weeks. Then in the 5th week, we collected data again, the post-intervention data. Then we washed them out for 4 weeks. So they had nothing for 4 weeks to return to baseline. We collected baseline again, and then we reversed the light. Those that saw the active light first saw the active light, saw the placebo light second. Those that saw the placebo light first saw the active light second. And then we repeated the protocol. And then the second study we did, we followed them for 6 months. So we collected baseline, and then we came back and collected data on weeks 9, 17, and 25 when the lights were on for 6 months. The lights were on, this was all in nursing homes. So the lights were on in spaces where they spent most of their time during the day, from the time they woke up until 6 p.m. And then at 6 p.m., the lights were turned off. So here are ways that we deliver the light, and we built all these lights here because there wasn't any product available. And again, the trick is not try to get all that light from the ceiling because it would be very glary. The trick was to try to bring the light close to the eye and make it diffuse so that it was not very uncomfortable. Now, one of the most successful applications we had was this light tray or light table. Because if you think about Alzheimer's patients, they sit down and they look down. They sit around tables and look down. So it was a great way to get the light at the eye. So it was a very effective way to deliver the light. So these are the results for the short-term study. This is sleep disturbances, agitation, and depression. This is the active and the control light. The gray bar are baseline data, and then the blue bar is the active and the white bar is the control. So basically there was a significant decrease in sleep disturbances with the active, not with the control. And when you take the difference between baseline and active and baseline and control, there was a greater difference in the active light compared to the controlled light. Same results for the agitation. So we have a significant decrease in the active, but not in the control, and same results with the depression scores. On the long term, and every time I present these data, I say this is to me my favorite study. If you look at 6 months in the life of an Alzheimer's patient, they are getting worse. And look at how beautiful those data are. They keep reducing sleep disturbances to a point where this red line is the threshold for having or not having sleep disturbances. After 6 months, they don't have sleep disturbances, even though they're getting worse. Same thing with depression and agitation. So there was a continuous decline. So what that is telling us, this is a continuous effect. We need to give them continuous brighter lights during the day to be able to see the benefits of light in this population. This was another study that we actually repeated those studies. So it was a replication in this case in 3 assisted living facilities in Massachusetts. And instead of 4 weeks of the intervention, we did 8 weeks of the intervention and 4 weeks of washout period. So it was very similar to the protocol we did before, but instead of doing 4 weeks of light, we did 8 weeks of light. In a way, we're trying to figure it out, what's the best, for our studies, what's the best length of doing the lights. And again, there were different ways of delivering the light. This is the light table I mentioned to you. We had light trays. And in one of the facilities, we actually retrofitted the lights inside their community. So that was the first time that we did an actual installation instead of doing those devices that we built in-house. And what we saw was, again, significant increase in the sleep duration with the active light, a significant earlier sleep start time, which makes sense. You get morning light, you go to bed earlier. And again, similar to the previous studies, we saw a significant decrease in sleep disturbances, decrease in depression, and then decrease in two other metrics of sleep disturbances. SDI is sleep disturbance index. So decrease in the frequency and a decrease in the severity of the sleep disturbances that they were experiencing. All of this happened with the active light. It did not happen with the placebo light. In fact, there was one case of the placebo light, the SDI, the placebo lights got worse. It got significantly worse, which is what you would expect in Alzheimer's disease patients. We are also working with Parkinson's disease patients. We did a very similar pilot study where we gave them 1 week of baseline and then 4 weeks of the lighting intervention. It was a pre-post design. And what we saw was a significant increase in sleep time and sleep duration. And this is just the way that the actigraphy calculates. One takes into account the number of minutes that you spent awake in bed, and the other one doesn't. But the bottom line is that they did increase the amount of sleep by receiving that morning light. And what was very interesting here too is we looked at a metric that we call it IV, which is intradaily variability, which is how consistent you are within the day, how consolidated your rest activity rhythms are. And a high IV means you're not consolidated and it's bad. And what we saw was as we increased the amount of circadian stimulus we were giving to the subjects, we saw a decrease in that IV, which means they were more consolidated with more light exposure. So here are some of the interesting projects we're doing in the future. We continue to do more work with MCI. We're looking at diabetes and how the light is affecting diabetes in mild cognitive impairment patients. We are doing proposals now to look at Down syndrome, autism, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and major depression and late chronotypes. Now, just summary is brighter days do lead to better nights. So if anything, go outside, go for a walk, get a lot of light during the daytime hours. Now, briefly, I know I have only a few minutes. I want to talk about alertness, that light is a cup of coffee. It's like a cup of coffee. So some of the studies that we have been doing, it's looking at the impact of red light in shift workers. Why is this important? Because blue light will alert people, but it will suppress the hormone melatonin at night. And suppression of the hormone melatonin at night has been linked to a series of maladies, including increased risk for cancer in shift workers, for example. So the whole idea is, how do I keep shift workers awake and alert without affecting their melatonin levels? And red light is a solution for that. So we have done 2 studies in the field trying to test it out to see if the red light helps. And obviously, in this case, with the trained control centers operator, we were looking at daytime alertness with blue light and nighttime sort of alertness improvement in sleep. If you don't get blue light at night, will you get home and sleep better after the shift? Because you're not phase shifting your biological clock with the blue light. You're not delaying your biological clock with the blue light. So this is how it was before. This train control center. This was in Istanbul. It's a project we did in Istanbul. And we retrofitted so that during the day, they had this sort of blue light combined with white light because we couldn't increase the light levels by too much because they were looking at screens all the time. So there was an issue with visibility. So we used the saturated blue light because low light levels of this saturated blue light will give you a very high circadian stimulus. And then at night, we changed that to the red light because we didn't want to affect their biological clock. What we found was, interesting enough, a significant improvement in the sleep scores with more morning light. So we did show that by increasing the circadian stimulus during the day, again, the shift workers were sleeping better. We did not show in the study that we did, it was a small study, we did not show anything on the red light. But we did show on the red light in this nurses study that we did, looking at the impact of 2 weeks of that red light at start, middle, and end of the shift. So we basically gave them half an hour of red light at the beginning, middle, and end of the shift. We work with day shift and we work with night shift. And what we showed was with the red light, there was a significant reduction in the response time at the end of the day shift, which is when they're mostly tired, and in the middle of the night shift, which is again, when people are mostly tired, is in the middle of the night. So we were able to see an increase in response, well, a decrease in response, so an increase in performance with the red light, which actually did better than the blue light for both the day shift and the night shift workers. So the last one, which I only have a couple more slides, is the horizontal vertical lights. We had done some lab work with that, and then we decided to install that in assisted living facilities with Alzheimer's disease patients to see if we could reduce the risks for falls in this population. We found after many, many nights of following them with those lights, we found a 34% reduction in falls due to the night lights. So this was a pilot study, and we only had like 38 residents that completed the study because COVID started and we had to stop. But we did write a proposal, and we are currently installing in about 390 rooms. We're working with UNC on that, and the project's underway. So hopefully we'll be able to replicate the results of the pilot study. So just to conclude, light and dark can and should be used as a non-pharmacological intervention to improve circadian sleep disorders. We do need to deliver the appropriate stimulus. And remember that light is just as important as darkness. So it is light and dark. Light can also be used as a cup of coffee. It doesn't have to be blue. We're seeing a strong effect of red. I didn't show any of the lab studies, but we have a lot of lab studies that we show that impact. And light can also aid in improving postural control and stability. So there's a lot of use for light. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And I guess we got a couple minutes for questions.
Yes, we'll take one question for now. I'm also looking at the Zoom.
All right. Someone has a question here, if that's okay.
Thank you, Nyala.
Let me go to the camera just a second. It's not that weird. So let me turn around. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm also from Brazil, and I'm so proud to be here. So anyways, my question, I'm an engineer education student, a PhD, and here at retinal, Lincoln. And my question is more related to the education, appliement of this kind of research. We've been seeing like different environments that we have less light, or different type of light and how that can affect like students, specifically like in lab, wet lab, you know, just different environments. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about this kind of different settings for students and how that can imply to different outcomes in learning, for example? Thank you again.
Yeah, I think, you know, the principles are obviously the same and should be tailored to each group of people. When you think about college students, they tend to be very delayed, so they tend to go to bed very late and not fall asleep early. So if you're providing them with better lighting in the morning, you can actually advance their clock and help them go to bed earlier and then sleep better and hopefully have an impact on performance. Now, measuring performance is very hard because there's a lot of things that can affect performance. So we chose to measure sleep, and we assume that if you sleep better, you're going to perform better. So we think that there's a possibility that if you're giving better lights for educational facilities, you can actually help them sleep better and perform better. We've done some work with 8th graders, and we've shown that if you get more morning light, you will advance their dim light melatonin onset and they will sleep more. We had not been able to show any improvement in performance because it was a short-term study. It was only a week study, and I don't think you see an improvement in performance. But I think that there is chances that you will get that improvement if you give them robust light dark pattern and improving sleep.
Thank you.
I have one question, Dr. Figueiro, before we get in, which is about daylight savings, right? I was wondering when you probably get asked that all the time. But do you have a sort of stance on whether or not we should be doing daylight savings time?
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually have a publication on a model we did, and we're just literally finishing up to submit for publication a study we did last year on the transition for daylight savings. And what we found from the study we did is that it interesting enough, our body readjusts to it very quickly. In 2 or 3 days, if you look at physiological measures, we measured melatonin, we measured sleep onset, we measured total sleep time, subjective sleep in it, and within a few days, everybody was back in sync. It was very interesting. So I think that my stance on it, and I know there's a lot of debate, is I actually think that daylight savings time is good to have the change because you don't want to have daylight savings times in the winter. It will be miserable because it won't start daylight until 9 o'clock in the morning, and everybody will be miserable. People associate daylight savings with more light. It's not. It's just that daylight savings occurs at times when you have longer natural photoperiods. So of course you're going to have more light in the evening because the days are longer. It's not the daylight savings time change that does that. And people think that, oh, I'm having more light because of daylight savings change. It's not. It's just nature. It's how it is. So I think that if you're going to keep one time, the standard time, I think it's better than the daylight savings time. But I do think that, yes, we're miserable for a couple of days, but within a few days, we're back to normal. And I think it's actually, we enjoy the best of both. So that's my opinion. And I know that not everybody agrees with that, but that's just my experience with it.
Thank you for that. Because we had the scheduled 1:15, we're going to go and close this session. Thank you, and Dr. Figueiro.
Thank you.